Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Eosinophilic Esophagitis EoE podcast. Today we are going to talk about medical treatments or medicine. We'll be talking a lot about diet and other stuff in coming podcasts, but today we're going to specifically focus on medical treatments, medicines for the treatment of EoE. And so let me take this in terms of the evolution of what typically happens when somebody's diagnosed with EoE. We're going to start at the beginning and what their GIs typically start with, and then we get more and more advanced with things that they try if the previous thing doesn't work. They keep on going down the list. So we're going to go through the whole list pretty much and talk about what either everybody is in for or what they've probably already gone through and where they ended up with trying to find that magical ingredient to help them with their EoE. So what you'll find is typically the first line of defense when you go into a GI and you get diagnosed with EoE is their first line of defense is normally put you on a PPI, a proton pump inhibitor like Nexium or some of the other ones that basically stop or inhibit the production of acid in your stomach so it doesn't come up into your esophagus, because sometimes that is related to the inflammation and stuff that's going on in your esophagus. So what they found is 50% or more of people that go on PPIs in the beginning respond positively to the PPI, and their symptoms are relieved, and they find relief from it. So they call them PPI responsive EoE patients. And what that means is they're one of the lucky ones, because if that's all it takes, then more power to you. That's fantastic. A lot of people don't have that reaction or that result, but that's awesome. Coincidentally, I just had a friend of mine whose wife was diagnosed with EoE recently. She's in her 50s, and she's had symptoms for a while, as in slow eating, not being able to eat fast, but not really anything that's made her do anything until recently, and it was just hard to eat. So she finally went in, and they stretched her in her. They did a biopsy. They stretched her to help her eat better, and they put her on a PPI, and she's already feeling better. She's found relief. The stretching helped a lot, and she may never have to do anything again. It's a minor enough case of EoE where it's not going to keep coming back, and now she's got relief, and she'll probably last the rest of her life without having to do anything, and maybe she'll stay on the PPIs, but because it seems to be helping her. So a lot of people have that kind of experience with EoE because it's not a major case of EoE. It's minor, and it happens slowly over time until it gets bad and they have to do something, and then they're fine for a while. And that's a good example of one. And my dad's another one. My dad, I'm sure he has EoE, never been diagnosed, but it's just minor. He's been stretched a couple times, and when he gets stretched, then he can eat fine for a while, and he just moves on and goes on with his life. So again, the lucky ones that don't have a severe case of it. So that works. So PPI responsive, that's number one line of defense. GI will typically do that to see if that helps. And then if it doesn't, we move on to the next step. Again, diet aside, because the next step could be very well diet changes or elimination diets and stuff like that. We'll talk about it in another episode. But for the medical treatment, they typically move on to corticosteroids next. So these are corticosteroids. They're not steroids as you would normally think of, like prednisone, which are systemic steroids, which are serious stuff. Corticosteroids are more limited in their scope, and they're more targeted in what they're supposed to do. So, for example, corticosteroids are meant for the esophagus, and they're targeted at the esophagus. And what happens is you swallow them, and by the time they get into the rest of your system, they're already deactivated. They're not still going, and they don't get into your system like something like a prednisone would. Prednisone is serious anti-inflammatory steroid, but it has a lot of side effects because that gets into your whole system. So these corticosteroids are targeted. They're meant for your esophagus, and the first one that they might put you on is fluticasone, or Flovent is the brand name. And it's an inhaler. And what they do is they tell you, well, don't inhale it. You spray it in your mouth, but you swallow it. So you swallow as much as you can, get it down into your esophagus so it can get to your esophagus and help prevent that inflammation. So that's number one. And let me talk a little bit about that. Flovent, in my experience, was, and this is a lot of people that I hear as well, the problem is it's such a fine mist, it just immediately sticks to everything in your mouth and in your throat, right up, way up high. And then you try to have to swallow it and get it out of your mouth and swallow it down and get some of it in your esophagus. I felt like I wasn't hardly getting any into my esophagus just because it was such a fine mist, and I'd swallow and try and get some down there. So I didn't find any relief from that, and I tried it for a short time, but it was more of a reactionary prescription that he put me on before they stretched me in another time when I was going through some tough times with EoE. But so I'm not going to judge it and say whether it works or not. It was short term for me, and I didn't find any short term relief, but I had major issues at the time, so others might find very much relief. So that's the first one that they might put you on. The other one is called budesonide, and the difference is budesonide is one of these. So fluticasone or Flovent is an inhaler. Budesonide is sort of meant to be inhaled too, because it goes into one of those machines, a breathing machine, but it's a liquid. It's a little vial of liquid, and you put it in the breathing machine, it converts it to mist, and you breathe it in, and it helps with your lungs and stuff like that. Again, that's what it was created for. So what they do is they have you swallow one or more of those vials of liquid of budesonide, and instead of just you can swallow it directly down. I did that when I was on budesonide, or you mix it with applesauce or Splenda or something to make what they call a slurry. And what that does is just makes it kind of more thicker instead of just liquid, more thicker. And when you swallow it down, it kind of coats your esophagus, and it gives a better chance for that budesonide to stick to your esophagus and have an effect there and get in and kind of work on the inflammation there. I found that budesonide definitely was better at getting into my esophagus. I didn't have a great experience with it. Budesonide didn't seem to help me any. I was on it for a few months, 2 to 3 months. It seemed to make things worse for me, but other people find relief from it. So you just never know. But my problem with budesonide was I quickly developed one of the side effects, which is thrush, candida, or yeast infection in your esophagus. So steroids have a tendency to do that. They increase the chance of getting candida or thrush, especially when you swallow them down to your esophagus. That's why they tell you have to wash your mouth out really, really well after you get this stuff in your mouth, whether it's Flovent or budesonide. You wash your mouth out because you don't want thrush in your mouth, but you also don't eat anything for a while after taking budesonide or Flovent after you swallow it down so it can get into your esophagus. So in the short term, I developed it. And what happens is, to me, it started off as a sore throat. I thought I was getting sick, but then it got more of a painful feeling than a sore throat. So I could tell it was just pain, and I figured that's what it was, and I got tested. That's what it was, and they give you something to help take care of that as well. But it's not pleasant. You don't want to have to deal with that. But it's one of those things that could very well come from taking one of these corticosteroids. Again, they're targeted. They're not, the risk of these corticosteroids get into your system causing other side effects like a prednisone would are very much less because of the way they work. They're deactivated before they get into the rest of your system or your body. And so your main thing is a thrush is probably one of your highest risks for that. And again, that's treatable and they can deal with that. So these are short-term solutions. They're trying to help you find relief so that you can address it and in a way that helps long-term, like with your diet and everything else, basically to buy you time to find relief so that you can find that needle in the haystack and figure out what's going on and try and fix it. So, but again, they work in over half of the people that try them. They have a positive response. So your GI may very well put you on one of those if you're not PPI responsive in your EoE. We talked about prednisone. I've actually heard of some GIs prescribing prednisone for EoE. I don't know why that would be, unless there were other symptoms in that person's body that would require that, because prednisone is it's pretty heavy duty for something like EoE, and it's not targeted, and it doesn't just target your esophagus. It's targeting your whole body. So if somebody's having major problems in the rest of their body and inflammation and stuff, I could see why that. But if your doctor prescribes prednisone, I would definitely get a second opinion unless you're having systemic problems in your whole body that you need something like that. So that is the typical corticosteroid use from gastroenterologists that they'll try to put you on. And that's kind of step 2. And then step 3 is are the new side. So this is the new side. They're called biologic drugs. And here's what biologics are. So they're the new world of developed drugs that are helping with a lot of different things. They're using them not just for they're not even technically using them for EoE because they're not FDA approved for EoE, but I'll explain how that works in a minute. These biologics are developed from living organisms, and they're typically done by an injection or a shot because the way they're created, they're too fragile for consumption. So if you swallow them down, your digestive system will destroy them before they get to interact with your body and do what they're supposed to do. So because of that, typically they're going to be injections and they're shot in your arm, and then they can do their thing without being destroyed. These biologics are kind of at the forefront of medical advances today. So they're kind of in the news a lot, and they're being used a lot, and there's a bunch of them out there for different conditions. But they're also much more complicated to manufacture because of the way they work and the way they have to be given with shots and things like that. And because of that, they're very expensive. So what you'll find is, number one, they're already expensive and insurance companies might not cover them. And number two, they're not approved by the FDA for EoE. So definitely insurance might not cover them, or most likely won't cover them. But there are other options. So there are trials that you can try to get into, and then you get it's free with a trial. The downside of a trial is you might get the placebo instead of the real drug, so it's all for nothing, and you may not get any results of it because you're part of the placebo on the trial. But the one great thing is some of these manufacturers, like Fasenra, for example, that we'll talk about, they actually have a manufacturer's kind of a co-insurance where they pay for it for you. So actually, I'm on Fasenra right now, have been for a few months, and I don't pay anything. My insurance company covers part of it, the way it was prescribed by my doctor, and Fasenra, the company, covers the rest of it. So it doesn't cost me a dime. If it weren't for that, I'd be paying $1,000 a month or a shot or whatever for that. So it's pretty bad, but there are ways to try and figure it out, work with your doctor and try and find a way. And what you need is a GI that will kind of sponsor you and say, okay, I'm going to prescribe and maintain your Fasenra for you. You typically might go to a clinic or an allergist or something to actually get the shots, or you could give them yourself. But Fasenra is a good example. I'll talk about that first. That's actually for eosinophilic asthma. So it's for people with asthma that are caused by similar kind of reaction where eosinophils consolidate into your lungs and they cause asthma and all this other stuff. The reason that people are using them for EoE is because they kill eosinophil cells. So what happens? It's an IL-5 inhibitor, interleukin 5, and what happens? And this is, I'll read you the technical term. It's an interleukin 5 antagonist that binds directly to the alpha subunit of the human IL-5 receptor on an eosinophil cell. So basically, it strangles the cell and takes away something that eosinophils need to live, so they die. And so that's what they do. That's what they're targeted to do, and that's what happens. So those eosinophils can't live in that environment, and these shots are given once a month for 3 months, and then once every 2 months after that, as long as you're on it. And so it's pretty non-invasive. It's easy to get the shots, and that's what happens. So, for example, I went on this a few months ago. Actually, it started in September. It's been almost 5-6 months now, and 2 months after I had the first shot, I had a biopsy done as well as a blood test, and there was no sign of eosinophils, so they were all gone, and which is a great thing. So because if you assume and have the foundational unit of the eosinophils are the cause of your problem, you get rid of those eosinophil cells, the result should be your symptoms get better and your disease gets better. So not a cure, but it's something that gets rid of those cells so that you can improve. And that's what the hope is for me and for a lot of other people they're on it. You'll find it more and more prescribed by GIs, and they're finding better and better ways to get you that medicine without having to pay millions of dollars or thousands of dollars to get every shot. Another one you'll hear about is Dupixent. Works a similar way. It's an inhibitor like Fasenra is. And what happens is, as you get into some of these other biologics that they're experimenting with and doing trials with and everything else, you want to pay attention to, well, how widespread is it? Like Fasenra, for example, is very targeted toward the eosinophil cell, and there's not any evidence of side effects having to do with the rest of your body. So, for example, with biologic drugs, you have to be concerned about it depleting or diminishing your immune system because it targets white blood cells, which are an immune reaction or immune response. You don't want that to be limited and make it so you get sick or infections or anything else, especially if you're old. And so you want to pay attention to that. Fasenra is good at targeting just the eosinophil cells, and so there's no evidence that it's affecting you in any other way. Dupixent, similar, maybe a little bit more from my conversations with my GI. It might have a little bit more of a risk of kind of diminishing a little bit of your immune system. And then you get into the others that doctors are trying and things like that. But so that's a question you want to ask and see what the effect could be. Side effects typically with these biologics are headache and sore throat, maybe. The big one that they worry about is allergic reaction. You could be allergic to one of these, and what they do is keep you around for a half hour after your first shot just to make sure, or maybe even your second shot, make sure you don't have any kind of reaction. And if not, you're off and running. You come back next month, get your shot again, and your eosinophils are gone. And so they're having a lot of great success with these biologic drugs. On these right now, these are kind of at the forefront of, wow, this is working well without having to do stuff like these corticosteroids. We have to swallow it twice a day or whatever and deal with the side effects of thrush and other things that come along with it. So right now, these are the focus of, wow, these are really working, and this could be the future of how we treat this until we come up with a cure. FDA approval. These are not approved for EoE yet. You'll hear on commercials when you see something like a Fasenra or Dupixent commercial, they're for eosinophilic asthma, and they'll say these are not for any other eosinophilic conditions, basically saying they're not for anything else caused by eosinophils because they've been approved for one thing only, and that's asthma. So, but I imagine it won't be long because that's where the direction is going. And a lot of doctors are prescribing this and getting this into EoE patients' hands and getting them the shots. So it's just a matter of time before that comes along, but right now it's not, and that's the driver for the fact that your insurance company might give you grief over trying to get these paid for. So again, work with your doctors, find a way around it. There's multiple ways to get around that issue and try and get these shots covered. Side effects are small or low risk. Allergic reaction is the big one, and then little stuff like injection site reactions. You're getting a shot, so maybe you get a rash or something there. And then anything that happens with your immune system if you take one of these that has a higher risk of immune system suppression. So that is pretty much the scope of the categories of drugs that doctors are using today in terms of treating EoE. And again, this is totally separate from diet and anything else they'll try and get you to do with allergies and staying away from allergic food and everything else. This is strictly talking about the medicines that they give to try to tackle EoE and help you feel better. Again, this is not to cure anything. This is just to give you relief and help you find a way to function so that you can figure out your disease and find the way to get rid of it foundationally the best way possible. And that could be the diet thing. A lot of people, if they can figure out your triggers, get rid of those, they stop having reactions, they stop having symptoms, and they're great from the rest of their life. They just stay away from that food. Again, those are the lucky ones that can figure that out. But in the meantime, some of these medicines might help you, especially if it's severe and you're having major problems. It's worth a try. It's worth a try because not having relief is more dangerous and more inconvenient than most of the reactions you might have or side effects you might have from some of these medicines. So I wholeheartedly recommend working with your GI, saying, okay, let's go through these. What makes sense? What are you experienced with? And if your GI is not experienced in all those things and doesn't know about the biologic side of it, then ask who is. I mean, who's at the forefront of your area in GIs, in EoE, and go visit them, get in there and make an appointment. So start having a deep conversation about this stuff. So that's about it. There are other things I've heard about in Europe that are kind of forthcoming, but these are the ones that the doctors that I talk to that are in the forefront of the United States. This is where they're really focused, and this is where most doctors are pushing it right now to find relief. So hopefully that's helpful for you, and we'll talk to you next time on EoE Podcast.